Hi everyone, how are you doing? Hopefully I'm finding you today on a good day. We are on Friday, only a couple more hours left of the weekend. So I'm not going to stand in front of you for too long, but I would like to talk to you about this presentation on who knows best. And by nature, the question I'm asking is intended to be initially ambiguous, but as we go on this journey, hopefully it will make a lot of sense as to why it's really important for us to care about who knows best when it comes to product development and the services that we deliver to our customers and clients going forward. As mentioned, my name is Abidemi. I prefer Abidemi, but some people call me Abby. I spent a lot of time in my career focused on customer services products that really try to drive forwards the lifestyles that we live, tries to anchor on a human need that we're trying to solve for, but also asking questions so that we don't answer the questions that we're faced with in the same way that we've always answered them before. And today, this really, this presentation really focuses on using one of those traits in terms of curiosity and also challenging our orthodoxies to ensure that we don't become autonomous in the way that we solve problems, but we always try to progressively improve what we're sharing with our customers. Oh, wrong direction. So, in a world of ambiguity, and by that I mean in the world that there's no complete no person, I guess, who completely understands the consequence to every action. The understands exactly what to do as a business in terms of providing products and services, and generally just knows what to do for the future. There is a sea of ambiguity, and in that sea, who knows best? I think it's important that we do care, but let's explore together as though we wanted to understand why we should care. So our focus today is going to first of all be on why we should care as a group of enthusiasts and professionals in the product space. The second is then targeting understanding who actually knows best. And then third, focusing on how we all collectively can do better in this paradigm of understanding what is best for our clients and customers. So, why should we care? Well, first of all, we find ourselves, especially in the post-pandemic, or hope, as obviously we all hope, the post-pandemic era, that lifestyles are increasingly digitally native. We've moved through a number of decades where we've gone from predominantly having a TV or a computer at home into mobility and then social. And now the digital native era is very, very much in full swing. And customers now expect that as part of the experiences that they have with any brand that they interact with. And so this means for businesses, there is now a mandate on them to create a relational agility that ultimately needs to make them feel more human by design. And the reason why I use the term human by design is because having gone through a number of different, I guess, engagements throughout my career, I've noticed that the thing that always stands prevalent to great brands is this sense of a core relationship that very much echoes how we build relationships as humans throughout our lives. So, in order for us to move businesses towards this more human by design nature, there are a couple of things that they need to consider. One is that innovation, which is talked about so often, can actually suffer from the automation of trying to create optimization of cost. For many businesses, when they're serving their consumers at scale, there is a very clear need for them to drop the operational cost in order to serve those consumers. And that's great. But if we over-index on this, we then become highly autonomous in the way that we respond to our customers' needs, to the point that we actually lose touch with those very customers we're trying to innovate for. The second is a desire that for the speed to market, desire that means that we need to get to market before our competitors in order to grab as much return on investment, can often leave businesses scaling something that should never have been scaled. And they find themselves losing lots of money because in the speed to market, At the point of design and query and experimentation, not enough questions were asked. And ultimately, there was bias infused in the decisions made to scale that thing that didn't really resonate with their consumer or addressable market. And this is all underpinned by the third, which is quite frankly, many businesses lack a consumer quotient that is deep enough to build these meaningful relationships that drive towards relevant differentiation that cause people who are interacting with the brands to feel like it's meaningful to them, personalized towards them, and actually makes an improvement in the lifestyles that they're trying to live. But let's build on this. As we look at the market and also naturally the outplay of what we've all gone through COVID, some research was done by Accenture, and what we found was that there is a rapidly changing consumer expectation as a result of the pandemic. That means that it becomes even more important for us to understand how to decipher what is the right thing to scale. What are the right ideas to scale? And what you can see in this diagram is the emergence of a consumer base that is being reimagined. And as we move to the next slide, we'll start to see what we mean by that reimagination. So the consumers are now moving towards these 5 new motivations. And you can see the numbers on the right-hand side. But one thing I'd like you to take away from this slide is when you look at the comparison of the traditional consumers to the reimagined consumers, there is a shift from what used to all be about price and quality into things that are much more conscious, health-related, sustainable, ethical, trustworthy. And so if again, in our discernment of what is right in terms of knowing what's best for our consumers, it's important as a product team, as a product community, we consider these other elements that though previously didn't seem to have such a large impact on businesses, are increasingly having that impact. And it also will move towards whether people will engage and become brand loyal or not. And so as such, building on that thread, as we said before, innovation is so core to the way that businesses need to move forwards in this post-pandemic world that we live in. But things aren't rosy and it's not easy. Innovation of itself, though it can be repetitive and consistent, doesn't necessarily always mean that you'll gain the return on investment that you sought or imagined you could do. And so again, it comes with a certain amount of risk that if we can, we need to mitigate sooner rather than later in terms of feedback loops or confirmation from the addressable market that what we're looking to innovate with is actually resonant and relevant to them. Otherwise, we may find ourselves again in that innovation trap that a number of companies find themselves in, which is that they know they desperately need to innovate, but they're frustrated by the lack of successful scaled innovation. Furthermore, in terms of sustaining that future growth that companies need, that longevity that companies seek to have, it's difficult to do that without this term relevant differentiation. And this relevant differentiation therefore suggests that this relevancy needs to be applied to the consumer, but also the people who are serving that consumer. The innovation that we come up with needs to provide some sort of importance that people will engage once it's scaled, but we cannot guarantee that. And so there are some things we'll talk about as we go through this session that we need to apply even as we scale and move things into production so that we continuously get the feedback loop that is so critical to the success of great products and services. But all of this needs to be based on a relationship. Quite frankly, this is what business is all about, relationships, and a shared trust between the parties. As we see from the CEO of Walt Disney, the heart and soul of a company is innovation. It's this desire for the business to constantly try to meet the human need of the addressable market in ways that ensure that there are improvements in their lifestyles, ensure that they're able to complete the mission that they set out to complete. And so we're left with the question to ask ourselves, how therefore might we conscientiously harness some of those motivations we talked about previously, knowing that it's not going to stay stagnant and continually fluctuate? How can we manage those motivations and expectations of these new, reimagined, addressable consumers in a way that gives us confidence that we know what's best to scale right now from the masses and masses of ideas that our teams are coming up with. Now, if that wasn't enough in terms of the focus of why we should care, there's more to this story. And as we go into the second section of understanding why this is so important, I'd like us to think about the hidden dynamics of the ecosystem bubble, the hidden dynamics that are created as we see technology emerging in the way it's doing, with trends such as hyperscalers creating foundational functionality that numbers and millions and millions of businesses are setting their own foundations on. And how that is also creating a dynamic that interacts with your consumer that again continues to move forward the expectations of you as a business. But there are some darker sides to this. And let's go through a couple of slides just to talk about why, again, this for us as product people is really important for us to consider. Many a time I talk to my teams and encourage them that we are really an assembly, a cohort of very talented people trying to meet an objective. But despite all of the superpowers that we might bring to play, it comes with a responsibility that is far greater than just the product that we're trying to create. As you saw from the post-pandemic numbers and insight, there is an increasing awareness being raised amongst consumers and indeed society about the implications of the products that we're creating. Previously, due to a lack of data, I guess, in terms of availability and insight, products were being created and the natural impact in the system that governs the world and society that we live in, detrimental to the equality of that third society, went unseen. But as we gather more data, we're now beginning to see some orthodoxies embedded in the way that our social systems and the world system is set up that is detrimental to driving equality. And so as product people, we are now given another burden to consider over and above just delivering what's right for our business, for our consumer. We must think about the implication on the wider ecosystem, because the products and services that we create have the ability to shape the very society and lifestyles that we live. Who would have thought smartphones could transform the way that people live their lives? Who would have thought that things like wearable devices would drive towards a sense of collective impetus towards well-being? Who would have thought the pandemic would have allowed people to reconsider and also be grateful for the smaller things in life? These things are incredibly important when we think about our products and services that we're building. But more importantly, and I guess this is the sincerity of this, is that we can empower or restrict the social, economic, and customer equality that sits outside. And we'll come onto a couple of examples just to address the reality of what's already happening and why it's so important that we need to engage in this topic. Because the amenities that we're creating is reshaping the underlying system that we live in. Governments are being further challenged by these large technology companies who are breaking boundaries in terms of the customers that they address. And it's opening new questions. It's creating for people a set of services that can be assumed and open to certain parts of society and then completely off the radar for others. Now, if we don't engage in this conversation, we unknowingly can continue to reaffirm the same systems that have created such diversity, gaps and inequality as the ones that we've seen in the past, and they find ourselves recreating that same thing across the system, both the world, society, but also humanity. Well, let's take a closer look at this. When our products and services take a lot of their capabilities and are heavily reliant on those features being delivered by a core group of product service providers, then ultimately our customers' expectations are also going to be reshaped and heavily influenced by those same core providers. And here I want to give us an example to think through. With the second wave of the cloud, as it were, coming into play, where the cloud as a technology, but as a mindset, is causing businesses to rethink their very organizational structures. There are core providers that underpin the ability to manifest those capabilities. And that's what we see on the left. On top of those, we have an emergent set of what I term as phygital capabilities, the blending of the physical world and the digital world, because our lifestyles have become so intertwined and combined by those two, and will increasingly become so, gives us an awareness of a new set, a growing set of highly influential technology platforms upon which we're reliant. And third, as product teams for our businesses, we will often use those because we want to accelerate our features and our products to market as we curate what we believe are hypothesize meaningful moments for our consumers. But have we ever considered that whatever you give away, that is, whatever you expect to be delivered by another party, means that you also are complicit in the overall experience given to your consumer? And so now what we see growing as a way of working are partnerships and ecosystems being created across what used to be closed environments, but are now becoming a lot more open. And actually, as part of this sense of being customer obsessed, this is a great trait to have. But also it comes with responsibility to consider how we steward the data of our users, how we ensure that our users' privacy is maintained, how we ensure that everything from the integration between, for example, Meta and Microsoft is governed by security that doesn't expose our consumers to untoward cyber attacks. You see, the responsibility on us as product teams is getting even more larger as we discover more technologies within a digital space that are growing towards meeting the lifestyle and enhanced expectations of our consumers. And then thirdly, to add to the further dimension of this critical need to know what and who knows best, we have to be careful that we don't allow our data to only reflect yesterday's trend or focus. Because if we don't, then all we'll do is just recreate an echo chamber that creates the same as yesterday in the system of tomorrow. We've got to be careful that we don't recreate some of the challenging orthodoxies that have maligned the systems that we've lived in before, by asking ourselves the question, should we, rather than just taking data insight from the past, consider how we can progressively create data and algorithms that model a future society that we want to see? Otherwise, what we'll find is that the personalization that we have will continue to be polarizing, as we've seen with a number of cases over the last number of years. They may end up alienating people and ultimately creating general discontentment because we have not considered the impact of trying to break the trends of what we see through data insight. We're further exacerbating them by scaling them with impact, but not changing them. And what you can see on this slide are a number of different cases where this has already happened, and we're very much right in this issue. Whether it be data provided to algorithms that create decisions that further segment and divide parts of society, that have a positive effect on one and a negative effect on another. My sister, my youngest sister, was affected by the challenge around the A-level results and the algorithm that's created. And fundamentally, the issue with the algorithm was that it presumed that if you came from a certain part of the UK and your school had a historical trend of only getting a certain number of grades, then you would conform to such. Now, I still don't understand how that algorithm was approved, but it was. And as a result, it affected many, many lives, not only in the sense of getting to university within that year, but people lost spaces, lost places, because it wasn't reflecting the broader society and the diverse environment that we live in. Or we go to facial recognition, which is something that really carries a buzz because people want to use it to drive further decision making. But the underlying technology isn't ready yet. And we're already seeing discrimination come as a result of it. And this is the discrimination that I want us to think about. When we make our decisions about products, when we make our decisions about what is right for our consumers, it's important that we're complicit, that our decisions aren't untoward to other parts of society to the point that it disenfranchises them so that they don't have access to these same services. One may say there is a need to separate luxury from fundamental human rights and human needs. I would barter to say that if we go to the passport system in the UK that continues to still look at certain people if the light isn't strong and misassociate what their faces are or the fact that they're smiling because they have large lips is a problem. Because now those people in society no longer have a way of benefiting from the improved services. They need to continue to use the older services because the service isn't complicit with their ethnicity. Or as we see in the worst case, we have even the likes of Amazon and their kit identifying someone as high profile as Oprah Winfrey as a male. Or we think about Fitbit and some of the technology decisions made in that product not being able to accurately track the sleeping patterns of people with certain melanin skin. Or worst case scenario, where we think about police and people being sent to jail or arrested on the basis of facial recognition, yet we know that it's failing. In many cases, my friends, we've got to become just as powerful stewards as creative and conscious designers of great products for the future. This is the reason why we need to know who knows best. Because if we don't create that context of driving great decisions within our teams that are complicit of the implications of the products and services that we're creating, then we may unknowingly be creating some of the challenges that we'll see in the future. So who does know best? Well, the reality is nobody does. No individual person is esoteric. Everything we all know as human beings is in part. We all have lived in bubbles throughout our lives that have shaped our very characters, that have shaped the way that we think, that have shaped our perception and lived experiences of this world. So no individual can know best by themselves. However, if businesses can become more human by design, as I mentioned before, and utilize the product ecosystem collective in order to drive questions and discovery and curiosity through the humility of hypothesis and exploration, then we can drive towards a shared value that has the empathy for the addressable market we're trying to serve. Because quite frankly, there are no sure bets. We must discover what resonates by pushing and pulling, challenging and questioning, so that by the end of the time that we've used that ecosystem of people, which is increasingly involving partners, platform providers, naturally customers because they're the people we're trying to serve, but also more departments within the business, especially those people on the front line who have an amazing amount of understanding of how customers are reacting and interacting with the products and services that we're providing and creating. And therefore their voices should be heard as part of feedback. Now, in terms of the shared value that I refer to, as you would imagine, given everything we've talked about in terms of the evolving, reimagined consumer, it's very difficult to be able to pinpoint exactly what is right and it remains static. Quite frankly, it's like a meandering treasure hunt. I'm not sure anyone else who's ever played Zelda back in the day, or any of those video games that once you discover a piece of treasure that's going to give you a power up, there's a finite amount of time before it disappears. And then you've got to go off and try and find it again, or find something appropriately different that will give you another level up. This is how it feels when we consider shared value. But there are things that we can do to make it easier for us to discover that shared value by creating a consensus and an interaction between more people than just the common traditional people who make decisions about products and services. And we'll come on to a couple of companies who've done this incredibly well by taking different approaches in order to make sure that the focus and objective of serving the addressable market, especially the consumer, is understood transparently throughout the whole of the business and not reserved for just a special few. Now, this mindset that I'm talking about needs to, by nature, break the silos of the way that we currently work within our businesses. I call this a model of discernment because it's a model that allows us collectively with diverse thinkers to decipher what is right for now, knowing that tomorrow we'll have to do the same exercise again to discover what is right for tomorrow. But this model of discernment becomes an engine of thinking, something that defines and conditions the mindset of the business based on bringing all parties to bear when you think about what it takes to serve a customer. And it challenges our orthodoxies so that as much as possible, we're not blinded by some blind spots. And we'll come on to some of the things we can do a bit later in order to burst some of those. But the reality is we must accept that human beings are biased and we have those biases in our system. But it doesn't mean that those biases should cause our products and services to have those infused in them. That's why we're all different. That's why we all have a unique voice to bring to the party, because we can be ambassadors of the bubbles that we've lived in so that others can be more empathetic to the lived experiences of those who look like us, of those who have lived like us. But there are four key themes I wanted us to think about, which I would term as winning themes. They're not the only, but there's four of them that I think are really important as we consider the hyper-dynamic connectedness that we're living in right now, and the fact, as I say, that we are moving between the physical and digital environments in a way we've never done before. The first one is actually this continuous evolution of the understanding of relevance, which I referred to back before. And that's underpinned by embracing the fact that if we're going to hyper-personalize the services that we offer, which ultimately will hopefully drive loyalty, especially brand loyalty, we need to have at the heart of our ability to be able to learn and grow through experimentation and curiosity. And in many cases, ensure that those interactions include the very people that we're trying to serve. The second is what I term as a multiverse mindset. And you can do this through service design, not service management, but service design, where we consider all of the various permutations a consumer or customer can find themselves in, because now customers very rarely go from A to B. They interleave between channels. They interleave between partners. They utilize gift cards or bonus schemes from one partner to be able to avail themselves of services on another. And so for a business, it's becoming increasingly difficult to track everywhere that their consumer finds themselves. But it's important that we consider how we can best maintain an understanding of those users, because that's what's going to improve our ability to personalize in a way that doesn't restrict them. The third is consumer centricity. I think this would go without saying, but it's important to have it as one of the core, because there are still many businesses who have not necessarily delivered upon that insight, or, as I said before, consumer quotient as they should do. And that consumer quotient is increasingly moving into the worlds of ethics, data compliance and security, sustainability, and ultimately digital trust between the consumer and the brand. What is it you're doing with my data? I get that you're trying to personalize for me, But what else are you doing with that data? Are you transparent with me? Should I be concerned? Will I find my account hacked because you've not applied the right cybersecurity rules? All of these things are the things that matter to our consumers increasingly, and so therefore they should matter to the business. And third, this proactive necessity to burst the bias that is intrinsically within the bubble of every single business. As I said before, it's not out of the norm for us humans to have bias. But what we can do is proactively try to burst those bias in favor of those that we're trying to serve. And by doing this, we can evolve our business strategies to center around those consumers, to drive a mindset across the whole of the business that is wholly focused on that customer obsession, so that every single department knows that their primary focus is towards the consumer and the customer, and therefore unearthing as much about that customer and discovering new things about that customer so that we can better serve them. Now, building on that model of discernment that I talked about, ultimately what I think we were trying to get to, and the scene worked really well, and actually people like Satya Nadella from Microsoft has called this out specifically as part of the transformation that has happened over at Microsoft, from being predominantly a software OS company to a cloud powerhouse, but also a highly integratable partner. And it's this sense of shared empathy. Why would we go to the extent of shared empathy? Well, it all really resonates on this point of customer obsession. No company really has all the investment and money to be able to build these hyper complex systems that we find driving these great experiences nowadays. It requires community. It requires partnership. It requires ecosystem. And so it's important that we are able to understand the shared empathy of the consumer we're trying to serve, so that we can go beyond the boundaries of our business and find the right partners to engage with at the benefit of the consumer that we're trying to serve. And ultimately, we build a relationship, an ecosystem relationship, where not only is there shared empathy for the addressable market we're trying to serve, but it also unlocks shared value within that community. And what I call out here is this core mindset and engine that is really powerful for businesses, which is this sense of listening as the onset before action. And listening being the broadening of the horizon to take in as much data sources as possible before then moving to try to discern through experimentation and conversation to that push and pull to understand what the meaningful actions are for the consumer we're trying to serve. And then the joy of experience. Going into that experience knowing that even if we have hypothesized and tested and try to validate as much as possible, we're still going to discover new things as we operate with that service in live and in production. And so therefore, it's really important that whatever we build, whatever we put into market, always gives the ability for a strong feedback loop from the consumer as to the resonance of what we've done. And increasingly what we see and observe, especially in the technology space, is a drive for the business to be able to experiment in live with their customers, do things like A/B and MVT testing, but in a way that has never been done before, because then you don't always have to run through a new release cycle to be able to prove or validate something is resonant with your consumers. Knowing that once you've identified something that is strong, you can then roll that back into your product portfolio and be able to roll that out because you have a heightened sense of feedback and confirmation from that community that it is important to the consumers. So I wanted to highlight some companies who have really put this ethos and this mindset and really succeeding in doing so. One of them is Fenty Beauty, and I really like Fenty Beauty for a number of reasons. But what really strikes me about Fenty Beauty is it coined onto something that was known a lot by the ethnic minority community for a long time, which is that cosmetics never really always had the right spectrum of shades that was inclusive for such a wider audience. And what Rihanna and team did was ensure that they burst their bubble, burst the bubble of orthodox or the orthodoxies within cosmetics, and spread the spectrum so that more skin tones could be supported across the board. And by doing that and making their product and services more inclusive, they have benefited very well, to the point that not too long ago, Rihanna was named a billionaire. And when they broke down the finances, a large amount of it has come from Fenty. Now, naturally, there is much more that would have gone on, but the critical thing I want to call out from this is that intentional breaking, or rather bursting of the bubble, to bring in a diverse set of thinking so that the team could discern what was right for the consumer or the addressable market they were looking for. Next is Microsoft, and I alluded to this before. Historically, Microsoft always built things that worked well with Microsoft Kit, much like Apple did with themselves, closed environments. But actually, as Satya Nadella has looked across and looked at his organization, he's realized that it's important that for the benefit of the consumer, Microsoft collaborates even more with their partnership ecosystem. Microsoft can't build everything, but they can be influential in helping to support delivering what's important to the lifestyles of the people that they're looking to serve, whether they be businesses or individual people. And this mindset has permeated Microsoft over the last number of years, to the point that now we see them again as a trillion-dollar business, overtaking Apple not too long ago. Another person is Amazon, and with Jeff Bezos, you often hear him talk about customer obsession. I remember when I first used to use Amazon way back then, one of the things that really struck me was the joy I had of interacting with their customer service. It was like none other. I wasn't left on the call listening to fancy music for ages. When it came to the conversation, it was a very direct conversation, one that was empathetic and understanding of the situation, and one that allowed me to complete my mission effortlessly and move on with my life. Now, I will say things have changed over that period of time, but I still remember it fondly. And as you continue to see Amazon continue to grow their footprint, it's all with the intention of trying to obsessively support the lifestyles of human beings. My favorite example is Slack, because Slack was a startup that employed some core fundamental principles in terms of customer obsession, but also specifically customer feedback. Slack wouldn't build features unless there was a pull from the consumers or the people that work for them, that is the workforce, for features. And then they will continually pulse to ensure that they were learning as much as possible, even after what was deemed as viable was delivered. And very quickly, they were able to move into a valuation of billions of dollars because they kept at the heart a core ecosystem of this mindset of empathy towards the consumer for what they wanted. Who would have thought back then when they started that they could overcome the big players such as MSN as these chat platforms? And not only did they do that, they were then able to reposition themselves, understanding more about how people were using their tool, and became a core integration platform. And they were able to bring engineers closer to the consumer, so the engineers, as they were building, were complicit of the very heartbeat of what consumers wanted, and would therefore allow the engineers to make different decisions in terms of serving those products or customer needs. Workday also, another great company that demonstrates the sense of focusing on what is important to the consumer, and then consistently checking back and getting feedback on a consistent basis, not waiting until it arrives in production, but consistently throughout the process. This sense of a humility to know that whatever we might hypothesize is valuable needs to be validated by the very people that we're looking to serve. Now, one I didn't put on this, but I will just give them an honorable mention, is Apple. Because at a certain point, they created for us a realization that sometimes the customer doesn't know what they want, and sometimes as a business, you will show them what they need. But again, this all resonates on the point of really understanding where the customer is at and how you can help them solve the human need that you're focused on in a way that is complicit of the wider diversity of that addressable addressable market and not one that is hyper biased towards the consumer that is easy to interact with. So how can we do better? First of all, I would suggest that we should focus on experimentation, learning, and scaling disruption with intent. It's so important that we design with evidence. I think gone are the days where we would rely on one person's gut feeling, though gut feelings are still relatively important and valid in terms of the diversity of the conversation. But what we do with our consumer should be evidence driven so that we can be transparent about the learning journey that we all take together. And ultimately, this allows us to build those relevant, differentiating relationships with consumers that fuel sustainable growth. I alluded to this before, but it's really important that we're careful of the power of negative space. If the decisions I made are vacant of an understanding of the wider audience that I'm trying to serve for, then naturally I'm going to create a subpar product. And I alluded to before the passport technology challenge that is faced in the UK. Again, there is a clarity that no one would have done it with intent to offend, but it reaches back to this sense of not having a broadened understanding of the data that allows us to discern better what is important for our consumers. And that's why I always champion for every business to spend more time listening to their consumer and those data sources to give them a better science of understanding the art of the possible that is meaningful for their consumer. The other is deploy a service design mindset with customer obsession. I alluded to this before, but as we continue to move into this world that is hyper-connected and that we as humans exist both in the physical and the digital and intertwined, it becomes even more challenging to understand the expectations of our consumer. And so with service design, we can really start to take a more holistic look about what parts of the business it takes to provide that service, but also how our consumers are interacting with the myriad of services within the business's portfolio, and also our ecosystem partners that you might be partnered with in order to deliver those services. The other is to intentionally burst your bubbles. And I think this goes without saying when we focus on the importance of why we're doing it, which is that we want to be curious and experiment constantly so we can drive towards that empathy that means that when we're building products, we're building them with an understanding of the type of challenges people face. For me, one of the examples I look at is when my only son arrived at 28 weeks. I'd never really interacted with the NICU ward. I'd never really understood the type of challenges that people face. But as he was born at 28 weeks, and then we saw him go into the incubator, what dawned upon us was the reality of what life could look like for those who are trying to impact and nurture their child at such a young age, but feel powerless because they need to rely on the professionals in order to get them through those early months and early days so that they can survive if at best. This empathy goes a long way when you're then trying to serve a mother who is with newborn babe, because you then consider that not everybody has their baby at the day they expect. This empathy then leans in towards the uncertainty, the pain, the need for a strong network around them, the need for information that drives our product to be a lot more inclusive than one that just assumes everyone's pathway is as smooth as one would like. The next is encourage conversation with feedback. And this is where I refer to the power of the people on the front line. It's important for businesses to invest in their employees so that they can become leaders who can drive forwards. And this customer obsession shouldn't be restricted to just the headquarters. And so in closing, when we refer back to the initial question, in a world of ambiguity, who knows best? Well, no one does. But we should co-explore and discover together as a product ecosystem, utilizing those relationships to better serve the consumers that we have. Because together, we, as those who shape these products and services, are shaping the future. So let's assemble the cohorts of diverse thinkers who have the right tension between each other in driving and challenging, curious and discovering, so that ultimately we create an inclusive tomorrow that doesn't replay the non-inclusive yesterday. I'll leave you with this one quote from Eric Ries, which is, the only way to win is to learn faster than anyone else. And this is so important because it reaches at the heart of the humility that says, no matter how smart we think we are, we're only just getting started. And so it's important that we apply a learning mindset, a growth mindset that seeks to understand more about those that we look to serve and apply our talents towards that, knowing that we'll continually discover more and more about those consumers as we work. Any questions?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Abidemi. That was amazing. I'm sitting on my seat just taking notes myself. It was an amazing talk. So we do have a few questions. The
Okay.
first question is, do you have an example of where this worked?
So as I mentioned before, people like the Microsofts of the world, people like the Slacks of the world, this is a core ethos that they use. Now, historically, people have seen this as part of what people use for startups with lean strategies. But actually, enterprises now realize that they need to embody the same thing because of the way that technology is rapidly transforming the lifestyles that we live in. So if you remember, I talked about Microsoft, Bentley, Slack, Workday, and Amazon themselves, Apple also. But there are a myriad of others. But the core ethos here is ensuring that we are empathetic to those looking to serve.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And the next question is, what is the most effective way to keep up with the latest technology trends, patterns, and news in order to ensure end user needs are met?
It's a really interesting question because it suggests the solution before the antagonist. One of the things I challenge my teams to always think about is to maintain in the zone of the human need that we're trying to
Mhm,
serve, then translate to the capabilities we need to provide that service, and then we make a decision on each capability and decipher the traits and characteristics we need,
mhm,
and then we go experimenting and discovering technologies that can either meet those needs partially or completely. This is a reason why it's so important that we think about buying, reusing, or building all the time, because there's never a one way that fits everything. In terms of discovering, absolutely go to conferences like this,
mhm,
absolutely connect with partners and engage with them. I often, as I go through and discover new companies through either reading about them through technology magazines or Gartner, I will immediately engage the company to help me with a demo. And it
mhm,
allows me to gain an understanding of what that provider can offer. And then over time, you can create your little black book, if you will, of
mhm.
product providers who provide different functionality. So that when the time comes, you've got something that is almost a book of reference that you can utilize as a team to then go and assess against the criteria you need.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. The next question is, how do we create systems that are easily evolutionary as the systems are reshaped?
It's a great question. Um, this is really the basis of why I continually use this term human by design, because I look at the human body and I look at the human engagement model through relationships, and it represents a pattern that, if followed, allows us to emulate this very evolution. Our evolution is always about constant discovery and understanding and learning of new things.
Hmm.
So, by very nature, we need to consider when we're serving a customer need or a human need, if you imagine a customer journey, and we have all those capabilities I referred to before, when we want flexibility, we create things like microservices in the world of modern engineering.
Hmm.
In cases where we want differentiation, we're more likely to try to build it ourselves. But in cases where the feature or capability is commoditized, For the sake of speed, if it meets the traits we need, we'll then probably more likely subscribe or pay for that service. This is a continual activity and why the role of architects is so important, because we're moving in a world of composition as opposed to going to one party that will give you everything. And so, ironically, within the product sphere and ecosystem, technology and product team composers are becoming a really important skill set for businesses to create evolutionary systems. Because then you'll make decisions such as, in the priority of the backlog and what we identify as meaningful and valuable to our consumer, which capabilities or features do we need more control of? And so therefore we'll create more flexibility in the way we create that solution. The other things maybe not so, because there is not as much value in us building those things. Then as we go through, we may then decide to replace some of those things with our own build if we believe there's differentiation identified in there. So the use of modern engineering skills and the architecture way of leveraging things like cloud in order to take a lot of that heavy lifting away from you and give you the flexibility to focus on the experience with the consumer, the closest touch point, are some of the ways that you can use to build evolutionary systems. But it's a topic that warrants its own conference. Talk less or talk.
Right. Well, we look forward to that next conference then. So the last question we have, I think, is at first it's like a two-part. It's a statement and then the question follows. So the statement is, oftentimes data without reflection and commentary does not truly reflect what is actually happening. And so the question is, how can we ensure that the data is not biased and truly reflects reality?
That's really, really, really interesting as a question, because by nature, we can never create the perfect data set. Every data set has a compromise in its veracity. The important thing is that we're aware of those compromises so that when we're making decisions, we're complicit of those. So unlike exam questions where we try to get the perfect answer, the reality, as I said with a statement, is that life is ambiguous. And by very nature, that's what makes this all fun. That's what makes this challenging for us. And so, though data is powerful and important, I strongly suggest that we always scrutinize data to understand its limitations, so that we don't arrive in a world where we're so trusting of the data set that we neglect the scrutiny of curiosity. Because we've already seen scenarios through things like the Cambridge Analytica situation and places where we don't scrutinize data well enough, we assume it's correct, and then we become misinformed. And then we make decisions based on misinformation. So I always strongly suggest that we don't lose the habit of curiosity when it comes to data and understand its limitations, because no data set is perfect.
Yeah. And that's been my experience. I've worked with a lot of people that are data-driven folks, and they make decisions on that data, but they never actually talk to the people that they gathered the data from. They're just analyzing the raw data, and it just blows my mind that you got the names and the people, take the time to talk to them, to talk about why you did, what caused this score that you did. Hopefully someday they'll catch on. All right. I think that's it for the questions. Again, Abidemi, this was incredible. I mean, I'm just fired up myself. I don't know how everybody else is feeling, but this is incredible stuff. I'm really grateful that you chose to be a speaker and address this topic. It's very well needed, and I'm going to do some research and try to find out more about it. So that ends this session. I appreciate everybody that came, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. So enjoy. And again, Abidemi, fantastic. I love it.
Thank you all. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.